The day of the funeral began with a sky the color of pewter. Margaret Hale, 42 years old and exhausted in ways she couldn't name, stood at the kitchen sink with a mug of untouched coffee cooling between her palms. Outside, the neighborhood carried on with its ordinary rhythm: a jogger in neon shoes, a delivery truck backing into a driveway, a dog barking at a squirrel that dared cross its kingdom. The ordinariness of it all felt almost cruel. Today, her father-in-law would be laid to rest. She set the mug in the sink and pressed her hand against the counter, grounding herself. Upstairs, David was pacing, practicing the art of tying his tie for the third time that morning. He had always been like that, restless, meticulous, a man who believed appearances could hold chaos at bay. "Let me," Margaret said when she joined him in the bedroom. She smoothed the silk into place with steady fingers, though her hands trembled on the inside. His throat was warm under her touch. For a second, she wanted him to take her hand and hold it there, to say something, anything, that would stitch them together in their grief. But he only murmured thanks, and turned to the mirror. Their daughter, Emma, 19 and wise beyond her years, waited by the front door in a black dress borrowed from her roommate. She looked fragile and strong all at once, like someone stepping across the threshold into adulthood and finding the floor unsteady beneath her feet. The drive to St. Albans was quiet. Margaret watched the familiar landmarks pass: the grocery store where Richard bought his daily paper, the cafe where he'd insisted on treating her to coffee after her first parent-teacher meeting years ago. Her heart ached with a dull, constant pressure. Richard had been more than a father-in-law. He'd been a steady presence, a man who noticed the small things: her love for the lighthouse watercolor in his study, the way Emma had always hated the smell of lilies. The church smelled of wax and old wood. A photo of Richard stood near the altar, his white hair a halo around a broad, weathered face. Margaret felt herself pulled toward it, the way one steps toward a flame for warmth even if it burns. "Granddad would hate all these lilies," Emma whispered as they sat down. Her voice cracked with a laugh that wasn't quite a laugh. "Yes," Margaret said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's cheek. "He would." The service unfolded in familiar motions: stand, sit, sing, pray, but Margaret felt only half present, as though she were a shadow observing her own life. The priest spoke of Richard's stubbornness, his kindness, the small ways he had quietly shaped his community. The words washed over her, comforting and unbearable all at once. At the graveside, Margaret let a handful of earth fall onto the coffin, the sound muffled but final. She remembered the first time she had met Richard. He'd stood on his porch with a mug of coffee and said, "So you're the one," in a voice that carried both suspicion and hope. She had surprised herself by answering, "I'll take care of him if he lets me." Richard had smiled then, that slow smile that meant she'd passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. The reception afterward was a blur of faces and stories. Neighbors recalled Richard's quiet generosity, buying Girl Scout cookies he didn't want, sitting with widowers on lonely holidays, fighting the city until a dangerous streetlight was replaced. Margaret listened, nodding, smiling politely, all the while holding her grief close, like something private and untouchable. It was near the end, when the trays of sandwiches had dwindled and the coffee had gone lukewarm, that a woman in a gray suit approached her. She carried a leather folder and wore glasses that suggested a life of careful reading. "Mrs. Hale?" she asked. "Yes. I'm Susan Larkin, from Larkin and Fielding. I handled your father-in-law's estate." "Of course," Margaret said, forcing a small smile. Susan lowered her voice. "I'm sorry for your loss. Richard was unique. He left instructions that his will be read today, at his house. He was very clear about it." Margaret blinked. "Today?" "It isn't unusual," Susan replied gently. "He wanted the family together." David, standing nearby, overheard. His jaw flexed, then smoothed. 3:00, he said, as if it were a business meeting. 3 then, Susan agreed. There are matters he wanted addressed immediately. Matters. The word lodged in Margaret's chest. She expected a simple division of assets: his modest house, the art collection, some investments. Still, the way Susan's eyes flicked toward her and quickly away left her unsettled. At Richard's house later that afternoon, the study smelled of wood polish and paper. Books lined the walls, the walnut desk stood like a sentinel. Above the mantel hung the watercolor of a lighthouse Margaret had always secretly loved. She longed to take it home with her, but she also longed for something far less tangible: the comfort of Richard's steady presence in the chair he'd once occupied. They gathered, David, Margaret, Emma, David's younger sister Claire, and Claire's husband Shane. Susan spread the papers across the desk, the official seal bright against the cream pages. The will began predictably, debts, accounts, personal belongings distributed with Richard's characteristic humor. The old Snowblower to Shane for the workout he insists on. A set of mismatched dinner plates to Emma, for the apartment she'll have despite our protests. The lighthouse painting, to Margaret. Then Susan paused, her fingers resting on an envelope. Richard included a letter. Addressed to you, Margaret. He asked that it be read now. The room fell still. Margaret felt everyone's eyes on her, the weight of expectation pressing down. To me? She asked. Susan nodded. He was insistent. Margaret took the envelope. Heavy, sealed with wax. Her name written in Richard's firm, deliberate hand. Margaret. No greeting. No preamble. Just her name, as though he were speaking directly into her chest. Do you want to read it privately? Susan asked. Margaret hesitated. Every instinct urged her to retreat upstairs, open it alone, shield herself from the eyes now fixed on her. But Richard had chosen this moment, this setting. And her curiosity, her fear, burned too hot to wait. I'll read it here, she said. The wax cracked as she broke the seal. She unfolded the page, Richard's handwriting tilting forward in its familiar way. Margaret, it began. I'm sorry for the timing. I've never believed in dragging out the hard things. Better to do them once, quickly. If you're reading this, I am gone, and you've already shown more strength than most. There is something you do not know about my son. About David. Margaret's breath caught. The room seemed to tilt slightly, as though the house itself had shifted. Before you, David was married to another woman. I protected him when it ended. Perhaps I shouldn't have. Perhaps my silence was more pride than love. You deserve to know the truth, even if it is painful. There are documents that will help you understand. Susan will provide you with what you need. The choice of what to do next is yours. I will not tell you how to live your life. But I loved you for loving my son, and I ask forgiveness for not telling you sooner. Richard. Margaret lowered the page, her hands trembling. Silence stretched taut across the room. Claire let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. Emma's eyes widened. David looked at the carpet. Before us, Margaret said finally, her voice raw. What does that mean, David? David's throat worked. He twisted his wedding band once, twice, then met her gaze with practiced calm. It was years ago. A mistake. It doesn't change us. But to Margaret, it changed everything. Susan slid a smaller envelope across the desk. There's a safe deposit box at Jenkins Federal. Richard instructed that only you, Margaret, could access it. He said it was for clarity, not cruelty. Margaret took it, the paper cool against her skin. She folded Richard's letter and placed it carefully back in the envelope, though her chest felt anything but careful. Outside, the late afternoon sun was blinding. Margaret stood by her car, the smaller envelope clenched in her fist, her daughter watching her with solemn eyes. Mom? Emma asked quietly. What are you going to do? Margaret looked at the sky, the color now a sharp, merciless blue. She thought of Richard's words, his insistence on clarity. She thought of the years she had spent building a life on what now felt like fragile ground. I'm going to find out the truth, she said. And with that, she slid behind the wheel, started the car, and drove toward a future she no longer recognized. Jenkins Federal was the kind of bank you stopped noticing after your third visit, a beige rectangle with tinted windows and a flag that snapped half-heartedly in the wind. But as Margaret and Emma crossed the parking lot, it felt cathedral quiet, every sound made larger by what they carried. Inside, the air was cool and faintly metallic, the particular scent of paper, toner, and old carpet. The teller's greeting was cheerful in the way of manual kindness, practiced, tidy, humane. Margaret slid the authorization envelope across the counter and gave her ID with hands that were steady only because she'd ordered them to be. Right this way, Mrs. Hale, the teller said. The name grazed her nerves like sandpaper, Mrs. Hale, as if belonging were simple, as if belonging were a title you could keep when the ground shifted. A corridor stretched ahead with an unflattering tile that exaggerated her heels into punctuation marks. At the end was a heavy door, The teller turned a key the size of a childhood memory and gestured them into the vault. It was colder inside, a humming quiet, walls lined with metal boxes like a library of secrets. Box 217 slid free with the ceremonial resistance of something meant to feel important. The teller set it on a low table in a small room, handed Margaret a brass key, and said, "I'll give you privacy." The door eased shut, a soft seal. Emma took one chair, Margaret took the other. For a moment neither spoke. The pause felt necessary, like a breath before a dive. "This is surreal," Emma whispered. "Like we stumbled into someone else's story." Margaret fit the key and turned. The lock gave, reluctant, then compliant. The lid rose on a whisper of felt and metal. Inside lay a thick envelope bound by a narrow blue ribbon, and beneath it a small black leather notebook with an elastic band. Margaret's name was on the envelope in Richard's firm, slightly forward-leaning hand. On the ribbon, a short tag, "For clarity, not cruelty." She untied the ribbon. Papers slid into her hands with the smoothness of old things. The first sheet was a marriage certificate. David Harold Hale and Caroline May Whitfield. Date, May 22, 20 years ago. A county 3 hours south. Margaret's eyes fixed on Caroline as if the letters themselves were a landing place. The name was lovely in a clean, unadorned way. Not trendy. Bone deep. She passed the document to Emma, who read once and then again, as if the first pass might have been an optical trick. "He was 22, Emma murmured. "He would have been 22. Another document followed, divorce decree, 3 years later, irreconcilable differences typed with bureaucratic finality. Margaret held it the way one holds an X-ray, aware that this thin thing contains proof of anything but thinness. There were letters too, 6 of them, all in Richard's hand. She unfolded the top one. The paper had the soft crackle of something that had waited politely for a long time. "Caroline, I am not writing to persuade you of anything. I am writing to say I am sorry. You were alone far too often while my son was in a house that had your name on it. He is not a monster, he is a man who learned the wrong lessons from being praised for his talent. I should have taught him the right ones sooner. If you ever need help, practical, not sentimental, tell me. I have no right, and I am offering anyway. Richard." Margaret felt something catch at the base of her throat. She read the next one. "You deserved to be believed. I did not believe you quickly enough. That failure is mine. The third. If you leave, and you may be right to, take the savings in the blue envelope in the top drawer. Consider it owed, not gifted." Margaret had a sudden piercing image of Richard's steady hands counting money, of him choosing envelopes, of him standing in a doorway watching a young woman with a thin coat walk down a set of uneven steps. Emma's eyes were luminous. "Grandad knew," she said softly. "He knew and he tried to help." Margaret couldn't answer. She lifted the leather notebook. The elastic band was stretched out on one side, tired of its duty. Inside, careful entries, dates, amounts, check numbers, a ledger of domestic charity. A name appeared 3 times, C. Whitfield, with small sums marked groceries, car repair deposit. Richard's handwriting was a landscape she knew by heart, and here it mapped a story she did not. At the back of the notebook was a folded index card. "If ever you need to find her," Richard had written, "start here." An address printed below in block letters. Not a full address, just a town, a street name, and hashtag 4B. No city. No state. A puzzle missing 2 pieces, with the quiet assumption that Margaret would know how to look. A small photograph slid from between pages and landed face down. She turned it over. Black and white, slightly underexposed. A young woman with dark hair swept back, a mouth too serious for her age, eyes steady and direct. "Caroline, 2004, Richard had written on the back. The room seemed to move without moving, like a boat shifting on its tether. Margaret set the photo on the table. She felt the odd urge to apologize to it. "I want to hate her," Emma said quietly, startling Margaret. "Because Dad lied by not telling us. But I don't. I don't hate her at all." She crossed her arms on the table and rested her forehead there for a beat, like a child and not. "I hate not knowing who he is." There was nothing for Margaret to say that wouldn't collapse under its own weight. Truth was a house. Sometimes you discovered the original blueprint under a wall. Sometimes you found rooms you hadn't known were there. She gathered the documents into the envelope, then paused at the ledger. One more note in Richard's hand caught her eye. Margaret, if you're reading this, you will do what you've always done, sort then decide. You're good at both. Don't let David tell you that you aren't. She pressed 2 fingers to the line as if it were a blessing. When they emerged into the brightness of afternoon, the sun had that colder edge of late spring pretending to be summer. Margaret blinked against it. The parking lot was no different from when they'd entered, someone wrestling a toddler into a car seat, a man in a suit talking too loudly on his phone, but everything inside her had rearranged. In the car, Emma buckled in and stared at nothing for a long moment. Are you going to tell Dad what we found? Yes, Margaret said. The word landed calmly. But not before I understand more than I do now. Emma nodded, jaw working. He'll be mad. Maybe. Margaret started the engine. He doesn't get to be the only one. They drove without the radio, a silence that felt less empty than protective. At a red light, Margaret glanced at the index card on the console. The street name had a familiar shape. She placed it a moment later in a coastal town 2 counties north, where Richard had rented a cottage for a summer when Emma was 7, and they'd all eaten corn on the cob on the deck under a stubborn string of white lights. It wasn't a long drive. It would require nothing but will. Back home, the house smelled faintly of lilies and lemon cleaner, the scent of condolences and control. Margaret carried the envelope to the dining room and spread the contents in a neat array, as if the order of presentation might yield answers. She took a photo of each with her phone, a practical act that felt illicit. David was in the kitchen when they walked in, sleeves rolled, a dish towel over one shoulder like someone performing normalcy. He looked up, relief rising to his face and then stalling when he saw the envelope in Margaret's hands. How was it? He asked, already bracing. Efficient, Margaret said. We should talk. He gestured to the table as if hosting a client. Emma hovered at the threshold, pulse visible at her throat. Margaret placed the marriage certificate in front of him. Do you want to begin? Color drained a shade from his face, then returned in 2 spots high on his cheeks. He picked up the paper and set it back down with lawyerly care. It was a long time ago. You were 22, Margaret said evenly. It lasted 3 years. 2.5. He rubbed his wedding band, a habit that had once felt tender and now read as code. It was a bad fit. We were kids. It ended. You didn't tell me. I didn't think it mattered. Emma made a sound she'd never made in his presence, something like a laugh that had forgotten how to be soft. It mattered to the person you married after her. David flinched. I don't want a speech, she said, and left the room with a dignity that forced Margaret to choose between following and staying. She stayed. Richard helped her, Margaret said quietly. He believed her when you didn't. David's gaze snapped to hers. Believed her about what? She didn't answer. He was the one who knew which confession would fit the lock. He closed his eyes for a second, then opened them a fraction darker. We were poor, I was ambitious. I worked too much, and when I was home, I was absent. I told myself it was temporary, that it was for us. She wanted something I didn't know how to give. I didn't hurt her. He swallowed. Not like that. Not like that, Margaret repeated, and let the words hang. You abandoned her in small, daily ways. That hurts too. He pushed back from the table and paced once, the floor accepting his footsteps like a secret it already knew. I'm not proud of who I was. But I'm not that man anymore. How would I know? It came out quieter than she felt. They stood looking at each other across the honest width of the table. The marriage certificate lay between them like a rock midstream. I want to find her, Margaret said finally. Caroline. David's reaction was more complicated than one thing. Annoyance flared and went out, fear crossed behind his eyes. Relief, was that relief? Ghosted his mouth as if he'd wanted the decision made and hadn't wanted to make it. To what end? To hear her story, Margaret said. And to decide mine. He looked away first, which felt like a small landmark on a map she hadn't known she'd been walking. Do what you need to do, he said. I will. After he left the room, Margaret gathered the documents again, putting them in an order that made sense only to her. She tried to swallow the old reflex, to fix, to smooth, to turn toward him with empathy before herself. It stuck in her throat, then loosened. She drank a glass of water and tasted metal. Emma returned, eyes rimmed but clear. "I booked us a room," she announced, holding up her phone like a warrant. "Small inn by the harbor. If we go tonight, we can be there by 9. I used the free cancellation rate, in case you change your mind." She said the last lightly, as if she didn't know her mother at all. "I'm not changing my mind," Margaret said. "Pack an overnight bag. Something warm." They moved through the motions of departure, charging cords, a sweater, the notebook, the index card, like women in a ritual older than their particulars. Before she left, Margaret paused in Richard's study. The lighthouse watercolor caught the late light and returned it kindly. She stood in front of it, feeling the small lift in her chest she'd always felt, that domestic, unremarkable joy. "Thank you," she said into the quiet. It was unclear to whom, the man, the painting, the self who had loved it and not asked for it. Maybe all three. They drove north as dusk gathered in the hollows of trees. The highway slid under them in long silver lanes. Farm stands blinked off their string lights, a fox ghosted across a verge and vanished. In the passenger seat, Emma scrolled through public records with the grim patience of a generation born to interrogate databases. "There's a Caroline Whitfield who changed her name," she said slowly, "to C.M. Hart. About 15 years ago. Teaching certificate. Coastal County." "Hart," Margaret repeated. "A simple name with an animal's quiet in it. It suits a woman who survived." They reached the coastal town just past 9, the air salted and clean. The inn was painted the soft gray of driftwood, a light burned in the office, a bell chimed when they entered. The proprietor was a woman in her 60s with steel hair and a mouth that looked like it said no when it needed to. "2 beds," she said, sliding a key across the counter. "Harbor view in the morning if the fog behaves." In the room, Margaret stood at the window and watched boats knock shoulders, white ropes creaking softly. Emma brushed her teeth and then climbed into bed with a book she didn't open. They turned off the lights and lay in the dark, sharing the civilized silence of people who loved each other and were afraid of different things. "Mom," Emma said into the darkness. "Yes." "If we find her, and the story is worse than we want, will we still be okay?" "We will be different," Margaret said. "But we'll be okay." After Emma's breathing settled, Margaret took the notebook to the desk by the window and turned to the index card again. She traced the street name with one finger, then wrote it on a fresh page in her own hand, testing how it felt to claim it. Outside, a buoy bell clanged with the patience of something that had been warning people forever. She set an alarm for early. The morning would be for searching. Tonight, she let herself remember small things. Richard's laugh when she burned the first batch of muffins in his oven but he ate 2 anyway. Caroline's steady eyes in the photo. David at 25 sitting on a milk crate in their first apartment, telling her about a case with an eagerness that had once charmed her. Each belonged to her history. Each would instruct her future. When she finally slept, she dreamed of a lighthouse cutting a path through fog, not erasing it, but turning the fog into something you could move through without losing yourself. Morning came gray and damp, the kind of sky that made you pull a sweater tighter and drink your coffee slower. From their room at the inn, Margaret and Emma could see the harbor half hidden in fog, boats rocking gently as though whispering to one another. The salt air was bracing, but Margaret's thoughts were anything but clear. She dressed quietly, jeans and a simple sweater, hair pulled back without care. Emma stirred under the covers and blinked awake. "Today?" she asked, her voice still wrapped in sleep. "Today," Margaret said. But first, there was David. Margaret knew she couldn't keep delaying the inevitable. She had left him the night before with nothing more than the truth in her eyes, and she had driven north with their daughter, leaving him in a kitchen full of questions he hadn't dared voice. He would be waiting for her now, pacing, angry, rehearsing defenses. She had lived with him long enough to know the choreography of his pride. While Emma showered, Margaret stepped out onto the narrow balcony with her phone. She dialed before she could talk herself out of it. He answered on the first ring. "Mags." The nickname rolled out of him, familiar and soft, a claim dressed as tenderness. "Don't call me that right now." A pause. She could almost hear him adjusting, swapping one mask for another. "You left without telling me where you were going." "You knew." Silence again, longer this time. "The box." "Yes, the box." She leaned on the railing, the metal cold under her palms. "You should have told me, David. It was before you." It didn't matter. His voice was sharp now, quick to cut. It mattered enough that your father carried it like a wound for 20 years. You don't understand. Then help me, she interrupted, more sharply than she intended. Because right now, what I understand is that I've been married to a man who hid an entire marriage from me. A man who let me walk into a life built on half-truths. His breath hissed over the line. I was protecting us. From what? From complications. From things that would only hurt you. You don't get to decide what hurts me, she said, her voice steady now, low and deliberate. That isn't protection. That's control. She heard him inhale, hold it. Then softer, she was never going to last. Caroline wasn't strong enough for what life demanded. You are. Margaret closed her eyes. There it was, that mix of compliment and condemnation, a blade sharpened on both sides. She had heard it before, in other words, other moments. You can handle it. You're tougher than most. Always said as though strength were an obligation, not a gift. I'm going to find her, Margaret said. What good will that do? His tone hardened again. Digging up old bones doesn't change the body. You'll only poison what we have. What we have is already poisoned. For a moment, neither spoke. The foghorn moaned in the distance, a sound so mournful Margaret felt it in her chest. Finally, David said, if you do this, you'll regret it. Some doors don't close once you open them. She stared out at the fog, the boats vanishing and reappearing as the mist shifted. Then I'll learn to live with the open door. She ended the call before he could reply. Her hands trembled as she set the phone on the railing. Inside, Emma emerged from the bathroom, hair damp, wrapped in a towel. She caught her mother's expression. He's angry. Yes, Margaret admitted. But I'm angrier. Emma studied her, then nodded, as though she had expected nothing less. They drove into town mid-morning, the streets slick with mist, storefronts just opening for the day. The address Richard had left was tucked into a quiet neighborhood of salt-weathered houses, clapboard painted in shades of sea and sky. Margaret parked at the curb and stared at the small brick building with faded numbers on the door, 4B. Are you ready? Emma asked. No, Margaret said honestly. But I'm going in anyway. The hallway smelled faintly of paint and old carpet. The door to 4B was a pale blue, worn at the edges. Margaret raised her hand and knocked. Once. Twice. No answer. She tried again, her pulse thudding in her ears. Finally, the lock clicked, and the door opened a cautious inch. A woman's voice came through, low and guarded. Yes. Margaret's breath caught. She had seen her face only in the black and white photo, but even through the narrow crack, she recognized her. The same dark eyes, the same steady set of the mouth. Older now, touched by time, but unmistakable. Caroline. Margaret said. Her voice felt too loud in the quiet hall. The woman's eyes narrowed. The door stayed half shut. Who's asking? My name is Margaret Hale. I'm David's wife. The silence that followed was so deep it felt like a weight pressing against Margaret's chest. Caroline's face shifted, surprise, disbelief, something sharper. Then, without a word, she opened the door wide enough to let them in. Inside, the apartment was small but orderly. Shelves lined with books, a plant trailing from a macrame hanger, a kettle whistling softly on the stove. It smelled of lavender and tea, not at all like ghosts. Caroline gestured toward the worn sofa. Sit. Margaret obeyed. Emma hovered near the door, unsure, but Caroline gave her a look that was neither unkind nor inviting. You can stay, if you want. Emma nodded and sat beside her mother. Caroline poured tea into mismatched mugs and handed them over. Then she sat in the chair opposite, spine straight, eyes fixed on Margaret. So, she said at last. Richard finally told you. Margaret's fingers tightened around the warm mug. He left me a letter. And documents. Enough to know you existed. Not enough to know the truth. Caroline's laugh was short, humorless. The truth. That's a luxury word. She leaned back, folding her arms. What do you want to know? Everything, Margaret said. Her voice wavered but didn't break. I want to know what kind of man I've been married to. Caroline's gaze flicked to Emma, then back to Margaret. Then you should be careful. Because once you hear it, you won't be able to unknow it. Margaret held her eyes. I think I already can't. Caroline studied her for a long moment, as though weighing whether to open the box she had kept closed for decades. Finally, she nodded, almost imperceptibly. Then I'll tell you. And with those words, the cracks in Margaret's marriage widened into something that could no longer be ignored. Caroline sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, the steam from her untouched mug curling into the quiet of the room. For a moment, she didn't speak. Margaret had the distinct sense she was deciding not whether to tell her story, but how much of it to give away. You said you wanted the truth, Caroline began at last, her voice low and steady. So here it is. I married David when I was 21. He was charming, ambitious, the kind of man who filled a room with his confidence. He said we'd take on the world together. I believed him. Margaret forced herself to stay still, though every word landed like a pinprick under her skin. At first, it was wonderful. He made me laugh. He made me believe in things, dreams I hadn't even dared have for myself. But it didn't take long for the cracks to show. He worked constantly, always chasing the next promotion, the next win. When he was home, it was like living with a man who was there in body but not in spirit. Caroline's eyes hardened. And when I asked for more, for his time, his attention, just his presence, he made me feel like I was asking too much. Like I was weak. Like I was failing him. Margaret swallowed. The words were familiar, painfully so. How many times had she brushed off her own needs, convincing herself that David's absences were just the cost of his ambition? Caroline leaned forward, her voice sharpening. He never raised a hand to me. Not once. But he had another way of cutting me down. Words. Silences. Making me question whether I was good enough, whether my needs mattered at all. He had a gift for turning things around until I believed I was the problem. Emma shifted uneasily beside her mother, eyes wide, lips pressed together. Margaret wanted to take her hand but couldn't move. What happened? Margaret asked. I left, Caroline said simply. After 3 years, I couldn't do it anymore. Richard, your father-in-law, helped me. He gave me money, advice, a safe way out. He was the only one who believed me when I said David wasn't who he seemed. Everyone else thought I was ungrateful, walking away from a brilliant young lawyer with a bright future. But Richard, he saw. Caroline's gaze softened for the first time. He told me he didn't blame me. That it wasn't weakness to want to be seen, to be heard. He said he wished he'd raised David differently. Margaret's throat tightened. She remembered Richard's steadiness, his quiet, watchful eyes. She could imagine him saying those words, offering compassion where none was expected. Did you love him? Margaret asked quietly. Caroline's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Of course I did. That's what made it so hard to leave. Love doesn't vanish just because it hurts you. It lingers, even when you know better. That's the cruel part. The room went still. Margaret felt the truth settle over her like a heavy blanket, warm and suffocating at once. She thought of the years she had spent with David, of the way she had excused his distance, his sharpness, the way he seemed always half somewhere else. She had told herself it was marriage, that no one's life was perfect. But now, sitting across from Caroline, she couldn't help but wonder, had she been living in the same pattern all along, too blind, or too willing to see it? Emma broke the silence. Do you regret leaving? Caroline turned to her, surprised by the question. No. I regret waiting so long. I regret how much of myself I lost before I finally walked away. Margaret felt a pang deep in her chest, a mix of sorrow and recognition. She thought of her own reflection that morning, how tired her eyes had looked, how heavy her body had felt in clothes that suddenly seemed like armor. Caroline stood then, crossing to a small cabinet. She pulled out a folder, thick with papers and photographs, and handed it to Margaret. I kept some things. Letters, receipts, pieces of a life I didn't know what else to do with. Maybe they'll help you see him more clearly. Margaret took the folder, its weight unfamiliar and yet intimate. Why are you giving this to me? Caroline's gaze met hers, unwavering. Because you deserve to know the man you're married to. And because maybe, just maybe, if you see him fully, you'll stop making the same excuses I did. Margaret felt her heart stutter. She wanted to argue, to defend, to insist her marriage was different. But the words caught in her throat. Were they different? Or had she just learned to wear her blindfold more comfortably? Emma reached out, placing her hand over her mother's. "Mom," she whispered. Margaret closed her fingers around the folder. "Thank you," she said softly to Caroline. Caroline nodded once, the gesture carrying both finality and release. "Whatever choice you make it for yourself. Not for him." They left the apartment in silence, the folder clutched tightly in Margaret's arms. Outside, the fog had lifted, revealing the crisp lines of rooftops and the shimmer of the harbor beyond. The world looked sharper, harsher, as though it had been waiting for her to open her eyes. In the car, Emma finally spoke. "She's brave." "Yes," Margaret said. Her voice was quiet, but resolute. "She is." They drove back toward the inn, neither speaking again. Margaret's thoughts churned like the tide, pulling her in too many directions. Love. Betrayal. History repeating itself. In her lap, the folder pressed down like a verdict she hadn't yet read. She knew that whatever lay inside would change her marriage forever. And for the first time in years, Margaret wondered if that might be exactly what she needed. The folder lay between them on the quilt like something animate, breathing, waiting. From their window the harbor moved in its quiet grammar, boats shifting, gulls writing white parentheses across the sky. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, fingers on the cardboard, not opening it yet. Emma perched cross-legged on the opposite bed, her knees tented under the comforter, watching her mother the way children watch the weather. "Do you want me to?" Emma began, lifting a hand. "No," Margaret said gently. "I need to." She slid her thumb under the flap and began. The top layer was practical: copies of a lease, a joint checking account opened and then closed, health insurance cards with both their names. She set them aside like stones in a circle. Underneath, a thin stack of photographs, birthdays and a Christmas that had not been happy even as the tree insisted otherwise. In one, Caroline stood in a kitchen with a cake that hadn't risen, her smile looking like it had. David's face was half turned away, a phone in his hand. In another, David at a desk in a small rental with a window the size of a shoebox, his attention pulled toward a brief or a future, something that wasn't the woman holding the camera. Margaret felt her mouth dry. She knew that face. She'd lived with it. There were also notes written in Caroline's neat small hand on index cards. What happened / what I felt / what I told myself. They weren't performative, they were a map someone had drawn to avoid getting lost in the same woods again. She read. "He says ambition is love in a different dialect. I am trying to learn it. He forgot the ultrasound. He brought peonies the next day. They drooped by evening. I thought loneliness inside a marriage was a failure on my part, like I'd misread the recipe and ruined the cake." Margaret didn't realize she was holding her breath until it hurt. She looked up to find Emma watching her, cheeks pale but dry. "Keep going," Emma said softly, not as a command but a benediction. Beneath the cards lay a sheaf of emails, printed and annotated, arguments unfolding in polite, bleeding lines. Margaret read one where Caroline had asked for a weekend together, just the two of them. David's responses were precise and gracious and pointed. "Of course we should, but this month is impossible. And you know I'm doing all this for us." When Caroline pressed, there was another of his. "Please don't make me choose between being the man you say you want and the man you fell in love with. They are the same man. You just don't always like how he looks under fluorescent light." Margaret heard the turn in that sentence like a key in a lock. "Admire my ambition or you are disloyal. Love me as I am or you are unreasonable." She had heard similar music in her own life, softer, better orchestrated, but the same tune. "Here," Emma said, handing her a paper that had stuck to the bottom of the email stack. It was a consulting agreement, a mutual non-disclosure clause attached to the divorce paperwork, written in legalese so dehydrated it crackled. Margaret felt the tremor pass through her hands anyway. She had spent years out of the workforce, but the language lit up her brain like a switch. The parties agree, refrain from disparagement, no disclosure of marital details to third parties, except as required by law, consideration in the amount of. "Did Dad make her sign this?" Emma asked, voice low. "Lawyers propose," Margaret said, though her throat closed on it. "People sign." There was a note clipped to the agreement in Richard's hand. "I argued for her dignity. He argued for his reputation. We split the difference and called it mercy. It was not mercy. Margaret pressed the paper to the bedspread, back of her hand to her mouth. She could picture that negotiation, David tidy with his points, Richard weary with fatherhood, and the late realization that raising a son is not the same as teaching him. Keep going, Emma whispered again, and Margaret did. Near the bottom of the folder were 2 medical forms, their paper thinned by years. One was an emergency room discharge from a late night, dehydration, stress reaction, Caroline's signature jagged with the fatigue of being human and not being believed. The other was a referral to counseling she never used, dated 3 weeks before the divorce filing. And then, near the back, almost overlooked, an envelope with a single photograph. Not of a face. Of a door. The photo was taken from the bottom of a narrow staircase, the door at the top ajar, light spilling through. On the back, Caroline had written, "The night I left. He was home, but only technically. Richard waited in the car. I thought I would die. I didn't. The next day I bought new dish towels." Starting small felt like starting at all. Margaret put the picture down and let the stillness accumulate. She thought of the time she had started small, a new planner when she felt lost, a different shade of lipstick when she wanted to feel awake, a salad-only diet after a holiday because controlling her mouth felt easier than controlling her life. Women invent rituals when their temples are crumbling. The phone on the nightstand stuttered alive. A text from David, "Where are you? This is not how we do things." Another, "You're making a spectacle." Then, 5 minutes later, as if softened by someone else's voice in his ear, "Come home and we will talk." Margaret set the phone face down. Emma's jaw jumped. "Mom," she said in a careful calm she had inherited from someone softer than her father, "when we go home, you should be the one deciding what we do from now on." Margaret managed a smile that didn't last. "That's the plan." They spent the afternoon walking the harbor because moving broke up the thoughts into manageable bits. The fog had burned off, the water lay like hammered tin. They bought chowder and ate it on a bench. A man in a red knit cap mended a net with the attention of a surgeon and the humility of a monk. Life, indifferent and generous, carried on. Back at the inn, a knock sounded at their door just as Margaret reached for the knob to leave for Caroline's again. She opened it to the innkeeper, the woman with steel hair and a navy cardigan that looked like it had belonged to 3 more patient women before her. "Someone left this for you," the innkeeper said, holding out a small paper bag with the inn's logo. "Said you'd know what it's about." Her eyes were the kind that got to the truth by simply existing. Inside the bag was a coil-bound notebook and a short note on kitchen stationery, "You forgot this. Or maybe I forgot to give it. See." An address was written below in quick strokes, the same apartment number but a second location, a school, apparently, and a time 3:30. "Staff lot. If you want the rest." Margaret looked at the clock. 3:05. She and Emma were out the door before they decided it. They found the school easily, a square of brick that had seen hundreds of first-day photos and the exhausted joy of last-day applause. In the staff lot, Caroline leaned against a compact car the color of rain. She wore a denim jacket and carried a canvas tote filled with what looked like papers, a stainless steel lunch container, and a thermos. She looked less like a ghost and more like a person who had graded too many essays and said too many gentle no's. "You came," she said, as if still surprised. "You asked," Margaret said. Caroline held up the coil-bound notebook. "The rest." She hesitated, then added, "And then I would like to stop handing pieces of my past to other people." "Of course," Margaret said. She reached for the notebook as if it were fragile. It was labeled on the first page in Caroline's hand, "Translations." Below, a subtitle, "What he said / what I heard / what I needed to hear instead." She flipped pages. In 3 columns, Caroline had recorded exchanges and their meanings. "I'm doing this for us / your needs are in the way / you're allowed to ask for presents, not only provision. Don't be dramatic / your feelings make me uncomfortable / your feelings are data, not demands. You're the strong one / carry it / strength is a choice, not a sentence." Margaret felt the page land in her like a clear bell. She glanced up. "Did you write this for me?" Caroline's mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost a warning. "I wrote it for the woman I didn't know yet. Turns out she was me, and possibly you." She shrugged, practical. "Possibly lots of us." Emma took the notebook, flipping, absorbing. She wasn't a girl who cried easily. She didn't now. But her shoulders rounded as if robing herself in a new, necessary garment. I can answer questions, Caroline said. Once more. Then I'm going to teach a poetry unit about metaphors and let the 9th graders tell me a storm is like anger for the 50th time. Why did you sign the non-disclosure? Margaret asked. Straight, without ornament. It gagged you. It protects him even now. Caroline's eyes didn't break contact. Because I wanted out. Quickly, cleanly. Because I didn't have money and he did. Because I didn't yet know I didn't owe him my silence. Because I thought my survival depended on cooperation. She lifted one shoulder. Sometimes we sign our names to cages and call it compromise. Do you regret it? Yes, she said, and then no. I regret the silence, not the leaving. If the cost of quiet was escape, I paid it and I live in the house it bought. She tapped the coil of the notebook. This was my way of making noise without breaking the law. I don't say what he did. I say what I learned. From the building, a bell sounded, the end of the day. Teachers began to stream across the lot. A woman with a red scarf waved. Caroline waved back with a softness that belonged entirely to her current life. What should I do? Margaret asked, surprising herself. She hadn't meant to ask for advice. She hadn't ever enjoyed asking for it. Caroline considered her, then looked at Emma, really looked, and then looked back. Tell the truth to yourself first, she said. Then to your daughter. Then to the man, if you still have breath for it. And before any of that, secure your oxygen mask, money, lawyer, keys, a place you can go and exhale. Men like David are situational reformers. They are wonderful at the apology and splendid at short sprints of improvement. You will need steadiness more than fireworks. Margaret flinched. You couldn't be married for 15 years and not recognize fireworks. I am not warning you away from love, Caroline added, softer now. I am inviting you toward your own. Emma stepped a fraction closer to her mother, as if to stand with and not against. The afternoon light did that plain, kind thing it does to faces told difficult truths. Thank you, Margaret said, and meant for it to be the last time she said the words. Caroline had earned the right not to be a station on the Margaret and David line. Last thing, Caroline said, lifting a finger. You're going to want to tell yourself you wasted your time. Don't. You did what you knew how to do with what you had. Now you know more. Do that. The bell rang again, the lot emptied a little more. Caroline opened her car door, then paused and reached into her tote. She produced a small square tin, its paint chipped, the lid faded with decades. Richard gave me this the day I left, she said. Peppermints. He said, your breath will catch, and you'll need sweetness right away. I've kept it in my desk since. There are 2 left. I think he'd approve of where they go. She pressed the tin into Margaret's hand. It weighed almost nothing and everything. Caroline got in her car and drove away without looking back. It did not feel cruel. It felt like a boundary that had learned how to stand. They sat in the parked car with the windows cracked and the sea finding its way in. Margaret opened the tin and found the peppermints wrapped in clear cellophane stuck to the inside with the persistence of old candy. She loosened one and placed it on her tongue. It dissolved slow and clean, a small sweetness exactly when promised. Mom, Emma said, voice thin and brave at once, what happens now? Now, Margaret said, and heard how steady she sounded. We go home, and I do what Caroline told me. I tell the truth to myself. Then to you. And then to your father. Emma nodded, looking both 19 and ageless. I'm with you. They drove back toward the inn with the coil-bound translations on the seat between them. In the room, Margaret spread everything out as if making a mosaic. It was almost evening when she reached for her phone. She scrolled past David's messages to a different number, a colleague from a different life, a woman who had returned to practice after children and now handled family law with a ruthlessness disguised as compassion. Are you taking new clients? Margaret typed. I need advice. Quietly, for now. The 3 dots appeared and then a reply, for you? Always. Tomorrow 10 a.m. My office. We'll start with oxygen. Margaret exhaled. A long, precise breath, as if she'd been underwater and had finally found the surface. She looked at Emma, who had fallen asleep with her head against the headboard, arms folded, a peppermint wrapper stuck to her sleeve. In the quiet that followed, Margaret crossed to the window. The lighthouse in the distance blinked its metronome of mercy and demand, on off on, cutting paths through fog not by scolding it, but by offering a different light. She rested her forehead against the cool glass and let herself say aloud what had been growing in her since the funeral. "I am not a woman who stays blind on purpose." It wasn't an oath and it wasn't a threat. It was a sentence with a period that knew it would still be true in the morning. She turned back to the bed, to the folder and the notebook and the tin, relics of other women's generosity and her own awakening. Somewhere between grief and clarity, she fell asleep upright, the harbor breathing its slow blue in and out, and the story she'd been living loosening its grip to make room for the one she would write next. The drive home was silent in the way silence sometimes carries its own conversation. Margaret kept her hands steady on the wheel, the road unwinding beneath the tires like a ribbon that could not be rolled back. Emma scrolled idly on her phone, but every so often her gaze slid to her mother, as though checking for cracks in the surface. When they pulled into the driveway, the house looked unchanged, lilies still wilting in a vase by the window, Richard's lighthouse painting still visible through the glass of the study. But Margaret no longer saw home. She saw a stage set, props arranged to suggest stability. A door she wasn't sure she wanted to keep unlocking. David was waiting. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, jaw tense. The picture of a man rehearsed and ready. "You're back," he said. "Yes," Margaret replied evenly, stepping past him. Emma brushed by without a word, climbing the stairs to her room. David closed the door, his movements controlled. "We need to talk." Margaret set her bag down on the console table. "Yes, we do." He gestured toward the living room, but she shook her head. "Not now. Not until I've thought." His jaw flexed. "You've been gone for 2 days. How much more time do you need?" "As much as it takes," she said. Something flickered in his eyes, frustration, maybe fear, but he didn't push further. Instead he muttered, "Fine. I'll be in my study," and disappeared down the hall. Margaret exhaled slowly. For years she had bent herself around his moods, softening her edges to keep peace. But now she felt something new rising inside her, like standing up straighter after years of slouching. The next morning, Margaret woke before dawn. She slipped from bed, brewed coffee, and sat at the dining table with Caroline's folder spread before her. The documents were more than proof of David's past, they were a mirror. In every line of every letter, she recognized echoes of her own life. She thought of the countless nights David had worked late, his phone glued to his hand at dinners, the way he had dismissed her requests for more time together as unreasonable. She thought of the way she had let it slide, convincing herself she was lucky, that ambition was love in another language. Caroline's words returned to her, "Sometimes we sign our names to cages and call it compromise." Margaret closed the folder. Her coffee had gone cold, but her resolve had not. At 10 o'clock, she sat in a small office downtown, sunlight catching on the diplomas lining the wall. Across from her, Helen Montgomery, an old colleague turned family law attorney, adjusted her glasses and leaned forward. "You don't have to commit to anything today," Helen said gently. "We're just talking options. Information is power." Margaret nodded. "That's what I need. Power. Not his. Mine." Helen smiled faintly. "Good. Then let's start with the basics. Finances, property, custody. Even though Emma's 19, it still matters in some respects. We'll outline what you'd be entitled to, what would change, what wouldn't." As Helen spoke, Margaret took notes. Her handwriting was slow at first, then steadier, as though her body recognized what her mind was only just learning. She wasn't trapped. She had choices. By the time the meeting ended, Margaret felt lighter. Not because the road ahead was easy, it wasn't, but because it was hers. Back home, she found Emma at the kitchen table, textbooks spread wide, earbuds dangling. She looked up as her mother entered. "How was it?" Emma asked. Margaret hesitated, then answered honestly. "Hard. Necessary. I talked to a lawyer." Emma's eyebrows lifted, but she didn't look surprised. And I'm thinking about what comes next. Carefully. For me. For us." Emma reached across the table and squeezed her mother's hand. "I'm proud of you." The words landed like sunlight through a cloud. Margaret's eyes stung, but she didn't look away. That evening she cooked dinner, roast chicken with rosemary, Emma's favorite, while David worked late in his study. The ritual of chopping, seasoning, stirring felt grounding, as though she were reclaiming a piece of herself she hadn't realized she'd lost. When the food was ready, she and Emma ate together at the table, laughter slipping in where heaviness had lived for days. David appeared near the end, hovering in the doorway. "You didn't wait," he said. Margaret looked up, her fork poised midair. "No, I didn't." Something in his expression faltered, as though he was beginning to realize the ground beneath him had shifted. That night, Margaret stood before the lighthouse painting in Richard's study. She traced the brushstrokes with her eyes, the way the beacon cut through the darkness, steady, patient, unyielding. "I'm not going to live half a life anymore," she whispered. And in that quiet moment, she felt it, not triumph, not finality, but awakening. The first breath after years of shallow ones. The first step onto a road she had chosen, not one chosen for her. The storm had been building for days, invisible but undeniable. Margaret could feel it in the sharpness of David's glances, in the clipped way he asked about dinner, in the silence that seemed to stretch thinner each night. He knew. He might not know every detail of what she had learned, but he knew she had changed, and he could no longer control which way the change would go. By Friday evening, the house itself felt restless. Emma had gone to stay with a friend for the night, sensing the tension like animals sense thunder. Margaret stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing the last of the dishes, when David appeared in the doorway. "We need to stop circling," he said, his voice low, measured. The lawyer in him had arrived. "Sit down." She dried her hands deliberately on the towel, then joined him at the dining table. The same table where Emma had done school projects, where Richard had once carved a Thanksgiving turkey, where Margaret had laughed and argued and believed her marriage was solid. Now it felt like a witness stand. David leaned forward, hands clasped. "I know you've been digging. I know you went to her." Margaret held his gaze. "Yes. I went to Caroline." His jaw tightened. "And what lies did she tell you?" "Not lies," Margaret said softly. "Stories. Memories. Documents. Photographs. Letters from your father." She slid Caroline's folder onto the table. "Proof." He didn't look down. Instead he laughed, sharp, brittle. "So you've let her poison you. After all these years, you'd rather believe a bitter ex-wife than your husband." Margaret's fingers curled around the edge of the folder. "She wasn't bitter, David. She was brave. She told me the truth you should have told me yourself." His voice rose. "It was nothing. A youthful mistake. I didn't want it to taint us." "Us?" Margaret repeated. Her voice was steady now, sharper than his. "There hasn't been an us in a long time. There's been you, your career, your image, your ambition, and me filling the silence you left behind." For the first time, his mask cracked. "You have no idea what it took to build this life. To provide for you. For Emma. Do you think it all just happened?" "I know it took sacrifice," Margaret said. "But the sacrifice was always mine. My career. My voice. My needs. And now I see, it was hers before it was mine." She pointed to the folder. "You left a trail of silenced women, David. Caroline first. Then me. Maybe you even convinced yourself it was noble. But it wasn't. It was cowardice." His chair scraped back suddenly, the sound jagged in the quiet. "I won't be lectured in my own house." Margaret rose too, but slowly, deliberately. "This isn't just your house. It's mine. And I will not stay quiet any longer." They stood facing each other, the air electric between them. Margaret saw something flicker across his face, anger, yes, but also fear. Not fear of her, but fear of losing the narrative he had always controlled. "You'll ruin everything," he said hoarsely. "No," Margaret replied. "You ruined it the day you decided the truth was optional." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For once, the lawyer had no argument prepared. Margaret stepped closer, her voice low but resolute. "I met with a lawyer. I know my rights. I know what I deserve. I'm not trapped here, David. Not anymore." His eyes widened. "You'd throw away 15 years? "I'm not throwing anything away," she said. "I'm taking back what's mine, my life. My choice. My dignity. The words landed like stones on water, rippling outward. For a long moment, silence reigned. The storm had broken, but not with thunder, with clarity. David sank back into his chair, head in his hands, looking smaller than she had ever seen him. Margaret turned toward the stairs. "I'll be in the guest room tonight," she said, her voice calm. "Tomorrow, we'll discuss the logistics. Not the marriage. The logistics." And with that, she walked away. Upstairs, in the quiet of the guest room, Margaret closed the door and leaned against it. Her body trembled, not from fear, but from release. For years, she had carried the weight of silence, bending herself around David's sharp edges, convincing herself the cracks were normal. Now, the truth stood in the open. She wasn't free yet, not completely. But for the first time in years, she felt something like freedom rising in her chest. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was hers. The morning after the confrontation dawned pale and quiet. Margaret woke in the guest room to the sound of sparrows in the hedge outside, their chatter sharp against the silence that filled the house. For a moment, she lay still, letting the strangeness wash over her. She was still married. She was still in this house. But the ground beneath both truths had shifted. She rose, pulled on a sweater, and went downstairs. The kitchen looked unchanged, the familiar mug waiting on the counter, the fruit bowl half empty, the note Emma had scribbled about staying late with a friend. But Margaret felt different. She was no longer tiptoeing through a life arranged for her. She was standing in her own. David was at the table, his laptop open, untouched coffee steaming beside him. He looked up as she entered. His eyes were rimmed red, his tie absent, his sleeves rolled to the elbows like a man stripped down to nothing but defense. "We should talk," he said. Margaret shook her head. "No. We should plan." He frowned. "Plan what?" "The future," she said, steady. "Separately." His mouth tightened, but he didn't argue. Perhaps even he knew when a case was lost. That afternoon, Margaret met Helen Montgomery again at her office. Together they began the work of disentangling 15 years of shared life, bank accounts, the house, retirement funds. It was exhausting, sobering work, but Margaret felt strangely energized. Each signature, each document drafted, was a brick laid in the foundation of something new. Helen studied her over the rim of her glasses. "You seem calm," she said. Margaret smiled faintly. "For the first time in years, I'm not pretending." Weeks passed. Emma returned to college, calling her mother every evening with stories of professors and friends and the strange comfort of cafeteria food. Margaret kept the house for now, but it felt different, no longer a cage, but a place of transition. She filled the rooms with small changes, fresh flowers that weren't lilies, a new quilt for the guest bed she now claimed as her own, a paint sample taped to the dining room wall. She also began to write. At first it was notes, scattered thoughts scribbled in a journal. Then longer reflections, about Richard's lighthouse painting, about Caroline's strength, about her own awakening. She didn't know if it would become a book, or a letter, or nothing at all. But the act of writing itself was a reclamation, each word a stitch pulling her back together. One Saturday, she drove to the coast again. The fog rolled in thick, swallowing the horizon, but the lighthouse stood steady, its beam cutting through. Margaret walked the narrow path up to the cliffs, her coat pulled tight around her. She stood there for a long time, breathing in the salt air, the crash of waves below. She thought of Richard, his steady kindness, the way he had left her not just a secret, but also the tools to face it. She thought of Caroline, who had given her honesty and a peppermint tin, who had shown her what it meant to start over. And she thought of herself, not as a wife defined by silence, but as a woman learning to live wide awake. That evening, she and Emma shared dinner at a small harbor cafe. Over grilled fish and glasses of wine, Emma reached across the table. "You're different, Mom," she said. "Lighter. Stronger." Margaret smiled. "I feel different." Emma's eyes shone. "I'm proud of you." Margaret squeezed her hand. "I'm proud of us. We've been through the fire, and we're still here. Better." Outside, the lighthouse blinked, steady as ever. Later, back home, Margaret stood once more in front of Richard's painting. She traced the beam of light with her eyes, following it out into the painted darkness. "I will be okay," she whispered. Then she corrected herself, voice firmer, clearer. "I am okay." And with that, she turned off the light, ready at last to step into her new chapter.